Bonjour. Avant de vous souhaiter la bienvenue, j'aimerais préciser que même si cette conférence se donnera en mode virtuel, il n'en demeure pas moins que les liens physiques où je me trouve et où se trouve la Fondation Trudeau est un territoire autochtone non cédé, euh, soit euh, Québec et Montréal, lieu de croisement et de rencontre de nombreuses communautés. Mon nom est Christian Nadeau, je suis professeur de philosophie politique à l'Université de Montréal et lauréat 2019 de la Fondation Trudeau. Je remercie la Fondation Trudeau qui a rendu possible l'organisation de cet événement. Je cède immédiatement la parole à Émilie Nicolas qui animera cet entretien. Émilie Nicolas est anthropologue et chroniqueuse au Devoir et à la Gazette. Elle se chargera de présenter les panélistes de notre soirée. Bonne soirée.
Bonsoir tout le monde, good evening. Je m'appelle Émilie Nicolas, je vais être la modératrice pour l'événement de ce soir. Premièrement, pour vous expliquer un peu le déroulement de la soirée, on a 1 heure et demie ensemble. Durant cette heure et demie-là, on va entendre Ingrid Waldron prendre la parole sur ses recherches, sur son champ d'expertise, donc sur le racisme environnemental. Ensuite, il y aura questions et réactions de deux personnes, Nadia, Joe et Carlo Charles, qui vont se joindre à nous après la conférence de Ingrid. Ingrid aura la chance de répondre aux questions. Et par la suite, à la fin, si on est chanceux, avec la gestion du temps, et si les participants coopèrent bien, on aura la chance de passer donc aux questions du public. Donc, je vous invite, si vous avez des questions, à les formuler dans la barre Q&A qui est au bas de l'écran. C'est là qu'on va pouvoir les intégrer. Je vous invite à les faire au fur et à mesure de la conférence pour qu'on puisse aussi les intégrer dans les conversations qu'on a ensemble avant même peut-être de se rendre au Q&A. Donc, vous pouvez m'aider à faire mon travail en quelque sorte. Donc, je vais passer tout de suite à la présentation des participants. Donc, Ingrid Waldron, she was born in Montreal to Trinidadian parents, is now based in Nova Scotia. She's a sociologist and assistant professor at the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University. She's been for the last 8 years the director of the Environmental Nauseousness, Racial Inequalities, and Community Health Project, otherwise known as the Enrich Project, which is a very great acronym. So the Enrich project is about investigating basically the socioeconomic, political, and health effects of environmental racism in Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities. And the project was the base for Dr. Waldron's first book, There Is Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities. And this book, which is actually adapted into a documentary that is now available on Netflix, which people can go and stream. She's also the co-lead of Improving the Health of People of African Descent, which is a flagship project at the same university, at Dalhousie University. And a lot of her research focuses on basically the impact of discrimination on the mental health and physical health of people, especially Indigenous, Black, immigrant, and refugee communities. And I thought and introduced Ingrid first before actually introducing the topic, which I also need to do of environmental racism, because basically Ingrid is going to speak to that. But in a nutshell, when you look at what her research is, it's actually a pretty good definition of what environmental racism is, right? So if systemic racism is basically the unequal distribution of resources across, different folks because of who is racialized and who isn't, then environmental racism is all the political action, structures, organization that leads to disproportionate impact on certain group of people in terms of their health, their livelihood, and their environment. So I think it's, I thank Christian for starting this conference by doing a land acknowledgement. And I invite us to keep in mind land acknowledgement and to have in mind wherever land we're on in Canada, because throughout this conference, because this whole issue of which land we're on and how often we forget about it is actually a core, a cornerstone of the topic that we're talking about. So I'll let Ingrid speak now, and I'll introduce Carlo and Nadia afterwards when they're about to speak up. So Ingrid, you can take the floor.
Thank you very much, Emile. Bonsoir. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Dr. Christiane Nadeau for inviting me. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so before I begin, I guess, the main concepts in my discussion, I'd just like to throw out a few questions to the audience just to consider as I present some of my thoughts and data around environmental racism. These are questions that pertain to the relationship between space, place, and health, which is very much the focus of my research on environmental racism, but my research in general. So the first question is, how do socially constructed ideologies about race, class, gender, and other social identities shape the constitution and perception of space? How are these ideologies spatialized in rural and urban settings? How is the spatial organization of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities enabled through boundary-making practices supported by policy and law? How do ideologies about race, class, gender, and other identities inform policies and actions on environmental racism and other place-based inequalities? And what is the relationship between place, space, and health? So in this presentation, I want to use a socio-spatial analysis to discuss the symbolic and the material ways in which the complex geographies of Indigenous and Black communities in Canada have been characterized by domination, erasure, and exploitation in the spaces and places where they live, work, and play. And in this presentation and in general, I characterize space as a socially constructed and highly contested product and idea bound up in political, cultural, and economic meanings. Throughout the presentation, I use the term spatial violence, and I use it to refer to the ways in which racialized peoples are harmed by state-sanctioned violence or policies, or the absence of policies that enable environmental racism, public infrastructure inequalities, and disproportionate impacts of climate change. So I wanted to provide you a succinct definition of environmental racism. I always use this definition from James Desmond, because while it's succinct, it packs a punch, because wrapped up in that very simple definition that you see there is kind of a complex articulation of the various principles of environmental racism. So James Desmond is an environmental activist in the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville. He's a longtime activist since the landfill was placed there in 1974. And this is a photo of James from when I first started to develop a relationship with the community. The project that I do, the Enrich project, is a community-based project. So one of the first things that I wanted to do was to meet community members, drive down to their communities, sit with them, and kind of do not a focus group, but a meeting, an informal meeting with a kind of non-standardized questionnaire, trying to get a sense of their priorities, the issues and concerns that they had about environmental racism in general. Because as professors, as you know, what we typically do is we decide everything. We decide what the objective should be and the research question should be. But with community-based research, the community should be driving that. So I met with them, I met with Lincolnville folks in 2013. And we filmed the meetings, which you can find that on my website, but we asked James to define environmental racism. And he said that the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian Native and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism. That's environmental racism to its core. So basically what he's talking about here is disproportionality. So one of the main principles of environmental racism is disproportionality, the fact that certain communities are disproportionately exposed to toxic burdens or health risks, that there is a spatial clustering of industry in certain communities. And those communities tend to be non-white communities or racialized communities. So in the case of Canada or Nova Scotia, in Nova Scotia, African Nova Scotian communities, Indigenous communities, and poor white communities. So it does include poor white communities. I can think of Harrietsfield, which is a low-income rural white community in Nova Scotia that has been dealing with contaminated water since the 1980s. So they've had a very difficult time addressing their issues. So it is also then an issue of class, an issue of socioeconomic status. So I think when we think about environmental racism, we need to think about intersectionality. The intersections of race, of gender, certainly in terms of gender, in terms of the harms to the body, because gender plays a role in the experience of illness as an outcome of environmental racism, socioeconomic status, but also living in rural communities. Nova Scotia is extremely rural, and you will find that most Black communities are in rural areas. There is an urban Black community in the north end of Halifax, but historic African Nova Scotian communities that have been in Nova Scotia for over 300 years tend to live in isolated, out of the way rural communities. So it is also an issue of rurality. So that intersectional lens is really important in looking at environmental racism in terms of who is impacted by environmental racism. But James also says that these are communities that don't have a base to fight back. And basically what he's saying is these are the communities that don't have economic and political clout. Having economic and political clout means that you have the tools and resources to fight back and perhaps to get your issues heard faster than other communities. But these are communities, because of the intersection of race and socioeconomic status and living in rural communities or isolated communities or on reserves, they don't have the clout to be heard in the same way as other communities. So this is a really perfect definition of environmental racism, but I did want to give you the more academic definition that comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who's considered to be the father of environmental racism. And I had the pleasure of hosting him here in Halifax at a symposium that I organized in 2017. So he's considered to be the father of environmental racism. He wrote a book called Dumping in Dixie in 1990, and has had, of course, several publications, not simply focused on environmental racism, but moving into climate change and transportation and food security. So he does it all, and he demonstrates the connections between all of these issues. So Robert Bullard defines environmental racism in this way. He says it's about the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to polluting industries. So that's exactly what James Desmond said in the photo earlier. He's talking about disproportionality. It's about the lack of political power that these communities have to resist the placement of these sites or these industries in their communities. So James Desmond also mentioned that. He talked about the lack of clout that these communities have. But it's also about the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening poisons in these communities. And those policies are environmental policies. It also includes environmental assessments. So you probably know that decisions that are made to place a particular industry or project in a particular community happens through an environmental assessment. That's the tool that's used to decide where industry should go. And of course, there are other environmental policies that come out of departments of environment. So in many ways, the decision makers, the people who develop those policies in a way where certain communities get dumped on in very specific ways. It's also about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policy. So the fact that it takes a long time for certain communities, as I said earlier, to be heard, but the rate of cleanup can be very slow. So comparing a community that's wealthier, typically white, of course, versus the communities that I focus on, you will find that is a kind of differential rate of cleanup in terms of who gets to get their waste cleaned up faster than others. And I think of a community like Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia that has been calling on the government to address their concerns since the mid-1980s. And as I will mention later, finally got the government to close the mill earlier this year at the end of January. But another component of environmental racism that's often forgotten is the history of excluding the people who are most impacted. So when we look at our environmental NGOs or other NGOs or boards, decision-making bodies, regulatory bodies, commissions set up to address the issue of environmental racism, you're not typically going to find Indigenous communities and Black communities on those boards. The people who are most affected, most impacted aren't sitting at the table. They don't get to make the decisions. And when you're not hearing from the people who are impacted, then there's a kind of handing down of or intergenerational manifestation of environmental racism. It manifests over time because you never have the opportunity, or you typically don't have the opportunity to hear how this issue is experienced by the people that are most impacted. And it's not always intentional. These are organizations that I know, certainly here in Nova Scotia, have a very hard time conducting outreach to these communities. They do try. Many of them have tried. They put effort into it. But perhaps it's the messaging. But they find it very difficult to engage communities, despite the fact that they want to do that. So this kind of intergenerational manifestation of environmental racism over time is an outcome of not hearing the voices of the people who are most impacted, who could share with you their experiences and their priorities, but also maybe how the messaging should be revised to capture the imagination of people who are most impacted. So as a health researcher, certainly I am very much interested in health. I am very interested in looking at the intersection of environmental racism, certainly gender, race, etc., and health impacts, because I think environmental racism and all issues around the environment are essentially health issues. Looking at the kind of gendered pathways in which toxic exposure impacts the body is an important part of my research. To look at the specific ways, for example, that Indigenous women are impacted by environmental or toxic exposures. But in general, I just want now to talk about some of the general or the most common health outcomes of environmental racism, and that certainly includes cancer. When I visited the communities and got to know the communities in 2013, 2014, every single community said the same thing. We have high rates of cancer in our community. Some of the communities said we have rare forms of cancer, and we think that it's linked to that dump. They talked about upper respiratory disease. Various respiratory illnesses is common, certainly asthma. African Nova Scotian communities tend to have high rates of asthma, while that is anecdotal information. And as you know, our federal government does not collect disaggregated race-based data. So we don't have statistics on that, but just in terms of interviews and qualitative data, this is what African Nova Scotian communities and certainly Indigenous communities in Canada have been saying, that this is one of their main health concerns: cardiovascular disease, reproductive morbidity, allergies, abdominal pain, temporary liver dysfunction, and seizures. I want to focus a little bit on reproductive morbidity though, because earlier I said that gender is an important identity to look at. Well, sex and gender, certainly. When we think about the ways in which environmental racism impacts the body. So Indigenous women specifically have high rates of reproductive illnesses and reproductive cancers. and birth anomalies. So a community like Chemical Valley near Sarnia, Ontario, that is surrounded by about over 60 petrochemical facilities. What you find is that Indigenous women have extremely high rates of various reproductive illnesses. So when we think of gender, that's what we're thinking about. What are the specific and unique ways in which illness is experienced based on certainly gender, but also, once again, we've got to do those intersections based on gender, race, and class, and where they live. So I want to share with you some of the communities across Canada that are dealing with environmental racism or have dealt with environmental racism. And this is Sabaganagati First Nation. This is Doreen Bernard. She's walking along the Shabanagati River in Nova Scotia near her community of Indian Brook. And this is a community that over the past 6 years have been trying to halt the development of the Alton gas brine discharge pipeline. Alton Gas has been trying to implement that project for about 2014, and the community contends that they were never consulted. They were never consulted before the project began, and of course they contend that they have rights to their land. This is their land, and that's a company that's come into their land without them wishing for that, and not consulting with them, and not having engaged the community properly. There's certainly other bands that have said, yes, consultation certainly was done properly, but this is a community that's one of 13 bands that has said, not with us, however. You might have done that with the 12 other First Nations communities, but you didn't do that with us. So they have been contesting that, and they've been engaged in a number of really fantastic initiatives over the past 6 years to halt the project, which have been actually successful because they've halted it for quite some time, right? A lot of civil disobedience and marches and rallies and showing up at the courthouse and engaging the broader Nova Scotian community through GoFundMe pages and other campaigns in order to halt this project. I think what they've done is really clever and effective. They've used Facebook, and they've used education at the Treaty Truck House, and they've used rallies and just a diverse, they've used diverse approaches in order to halt this project, and have engaged allies along the way. So I think it's a successful approach. It's an effective approach that they've used over the years to halt that project. It doesn't mean the project is not going ahead, but they were successful earlier this year in April with their appeal. So the judge ordered the province to go back and consult with the community for 120 days. That's a major milestone because that hasn't happened before. The Minister of Environment way back in 2016 said, and she's no longer the Minister of Environment, but she said consultations were done well. There's no need to do further consultations. And finally, in April of this year, the judge said, nope, they need to go back and do those consultations for 120 days. So that's a major milestone and achievement for this community. Doreen Bernard here in this photo was featured. If you saw the documentary on Netflix, she's featured in the documentary. Here we have Boat Harbor, the contaminated Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation. So the pulp mill started to dump effluent into Boat Harbor and Pictou Landing First Nation starting in 1967. And throughout the years, particularly starting in the mid-1980s, the community has been calling on the government to address this. And there have been broken promises along the way over that time. And the community, once again, has been, just like other communities, has been engaged in rallies and various forms of civil disobedience and different actions. And in 2015, then Minister of Environment, Randy DeLore, said that if the mill did not come back with a robust environmental assessment, that the mill was shut down in 2020. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that did happen at the end of January this year. It did. So this is a milestone. This is a major success for this community, given the fact that they've been dealing with this issue since 1967. This is another community that was also featured in the film. You heard from Michelle Francis, who is one of the activists around the boat harbor contaminated site. Amjinwan First Nation. I talked a little bit about Amjinwan First Nation earlier when I talked about reproductive illnesses and birth anomalies. It's called, Chemical Valley near Sarnia, Ontario. And as I mentioned, they have over 60 petrochemical facilities surrounding the community, which is astounding. And high rates of cancer, respiratory illness, etc. There have been a lot of action on this issue. I had the pleasure of hearing Vanessa Gray speak. Vanessa Gray is a young activist who spoke at one of my symposiums, the same symposium that I invited Dr. Robert Bullard to in 2017. And yeah, she's a passionate activist who has been addressing this particular issue. And I think recently created a map. I can't explain it fairly properly at this point, but she's created a map in collaboration with, I believe, University of Toronto professors in order to track, I think, what's happening in her community. But it looked really inventive. I can't recall exactly all the details of it. Yeah, so she's really been a passionate activist around this particular issue. We have Grassy Narrows First Nation, and you probably heard about Grassy Narrows First Nation near Kenora, Ontario. And they have been concerned about mercury contamination dumped in 1960s and 1970s, contamination in the Wabigoon English River near their community. So they certainly have concerns about health and their fish, of course, and ongoing health issues that they're still trying to address. Although some of their issues have been addressed by government, they have ongoing health issues, just like many of these communities. It doesn't matter whether or not a dump was closed, like in the case of Shelburne, which I'll talk about later. Community members are still concerned about the health impacts of living near to these projects. A community that has been in the news quite a bit over the past 2 years is Wet'suwet'en First Nation. And throughout Canada, mass demonstrations, sit-ins, blockades have gripped, various parts of Canada over the movement to support the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation, who are opposed to this multi-billion-dollar pipeline project in northern British Columbia. Africville certainly is a historical case of environmental racism, but I could tell you what's happening right now. It's also a current, present day case of environmental racism. So they often talk about, in books that have been written about Africville, the ways in which industry owners came into the community and raised Africville. We often talk about the raising of Africville. Africville is both an example of gentrification or urban renewal, urban revitalization, and environmental racism. It's both. So this was a community, a historic African Nova Scotian community that was subjected to urban revitalization. The city of Halifax wanted to make way for development and industry. And what happened was that this community was displaced, expropriated, pushed out of their community. Certainly it wasn't a wealthy community. There are no wealthy African Nova Scotian communities or Black communities in Canada, but it was a well-functioning community that there was a sense of cohesion, and many members of the community actually owned their own businesses. So in terms of when we talk about social networks as a determinant of health, this was a community that was a well-functioning, close-knit community. When they were expropriated out of their community, many of them ended up in the North End. The North End, as I mentioned earlier, is one urban African Nova Scotian community. I would say perhaps the only one, but they were pushed into social housing, an area called Uniacke Square in the north end of Halifax with a lot of social housing. And many of these community members, descendants of Africville, would say that we are still traumatized by the expropriation of community members. So I'm talking a little bit about urban revitalization, but Why is it an example of environmental racism? Because in the midst of the development by the city of Halifax, what was left in the community included a number of environmental hazards, like a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. And in the past month, actually, the community has been banding together to say we want reparations. They did try to request a class action lawsuit in 2016 that was then thrown out in 2018. But over the past month, there's been a lot of action from the descendants of Africville online. I just yesterday sent out an email because they're looking for donations, but what they really want is reparations. They want the government to acknowledge what they've lost financially, also socially, from the raising of Africville, and want compensation. Here's Lincolnville. So James Desmond, I showed you a photo of James Desmond earlier. I said he's an activist, a longtime activist in Lincolnville. This is the Lincolnville dump. The Lincolnville dump, so there's a first and second generation dump in Lincolnville. That's why the community is so concerned. The first generation landfill, let's call it a landfill, was put there in 1974. And the second generation landfill was put there in 2006, but it was put on top of the first generation landfill. So there's a concern that that the contaminated water from the first generation landfill is seeping into the second generation landfill. The community members would say, over the years since 1974, we've had high rates of cancer. It's increased over that time, and we link that to the landfill. And Shelburne, featured in the Netflix documentary, the first person in the documentary was Louise DeLille. And I met with Louise at the end of 2015, and I was stunned when, she sat down in my office and she said, 97% of the people in my community have cancer. And I actually thought she was lying, because I had never, when I say I'd never heard of that, I did hear of that in terms of there's a community in near Louisiana, I believe, in the United States, or in Louisiana, called Cancer Alley, African American community. And I remember reading about that about 5 years ago, and I was stunned by that. But when Louise said to me, 98% of the people in my community have cancer, the Black men have died out, this is a community of widows, Black women have been left, and the men have died out, I thought, this can't be. But she discusses that at length, certainly in the film. So this is a community that has been contending with the dump, or the Shelburne landfill, since 1943, and everything kind of went into that dump. And of course, I just mentioned the connection between cancer. They have high rates of multiple myeloma as well. I'm not sure if it's the highest rate in Nova Scotia, but multiple myeloma is a blood cancer. But what they've been able to do over the past 5 years since I've met Louise is stunning, and she's led all of it. Yeah, I don't have enough time to explain it, but she, just to kind of prove it, she won a Nova Scotia Human Rights Award in December of 2018 for the work that she's done. Public infrastructure is also a place-based issue, and I find that it intersects with the issue certainly of environmental racism. While the Department of Environment in Nova Scotia deals with, environmental issues and projects, I see intersections in terms of the work that I've done. And I certainly, I did a project on gentrification in the North End. So the connection between Africville and African Nova Scotians in the North End in Uniacke Square, as I mentioned earlier, that's quite clear. But I see environmental racism, and I also see the fact that many of these communities that I work with are on well water rather than municipal water. These are public infrastructure inequalities. And I don't think they're just happenstance. I think policies, as I mentioned earlier, are often a result or shaped by the people who make those policies, and the people who make those policies often don't look like me. So that's what's problematic. So that's how I see the intersection of both issues, environmental racism and public infrastructure. And I see public infrastructure inequalities and planning policies as a form of spatial violence. Spatial violence, as I said earlier, is the ways in which policies and decisions are made in ways that harm communities on the ground. So when we think of spatial violence, we know then that it manifests in policies and sometimes the absence of policies, right? Policies that are there that are harmful, but the fact that sometimes government doesn't even consider certain communities and don't put policies in place to address their concerns. So when we think of policies, it's about the presence, the existence of policies, but also the absence of policies. So across North American cities, we know that certainly underprivileged populations, racialized people specifically, because they are disproportionately underprivileged or low income, have less access to green space than affluent groups. And I'm certainly finding this with the communities that I'm looking at who are dealing with environmental racism. I think of Louise DeLille in Shelburne, who said, we don't have sidewalks in Shelburne. We don't really have green space. Our medical centers only open half day. These are public infrastructure issues that to me should not be discussed in isolation from the issue of environmental racism. So in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal, public infrastructure inequalities manifest in low-income households, having limited access to the benefits provided by vegetation. Green space, vegetation, the built environment, these are social determinants of health. And if you have access to these things, these factors, these features of the built environment, you tend to be healthier. We will find, or you will find, or all of us will find that green space is certainly much more common in affluent or higher income neighborhoods. You are more likely to find a park or recreation center, a place to sit, etc., just to enjoy the outdoors in communities that are more affluent. And there are health benefits of having access to vegetation and green space. In Black communities in Nova Scotia, in addition to environmental racism, they have a number of public infrastructure harms. So of course, environmental racism, but also in a community like Lucasville, a historic African Nova Scotian community, about 5 years ago, they were dealing with zoning bylaws that actually shrunk their community in size. So people were coming in, industry people were coming in, and they shrunk using zoning bylaws, which is like a policy, obviously. And the community was cut in half. And this was a flourishing community of African Nova Scotians, once again, over 200 years old. They've been in Nova Scotia and felt that their community was shrinking because of projects that were taking place in that community. In communities like North Preston and East Preston, African Nova Scotian communities, they're dealing with, once again, similar to Shelburne, being on well water and arsenic in their water. In East Preston, they have concerns about transportation. They don't have a bus that runs for most of the day, unlike other communities nearby. So these are all public infrastructure issues, inequalities that come out of planning. And for me, comes out of the fact that these are communities that are not valued, right? So you don't put policies in place like good transit, reliable transit, because at times you don't think certain communities are valuable. And once again, that's connected to environmental racism. So over the past 8 years, since I've been leading the Enrich project, I've been trying to address many of these intersecting issues. This project is not a project that I sought out. It came to me. It came to me from an environmental activist who phoned me up one day and he said, I want you to take on this project on environmental racism. He met with me and I said to him, I've never heard of this term environmental racism. What is it? He explained it to me and I thought, I don't know if I want to do this because it sounds ludicrous. I don't understand how the environment is racist, was my first thought, which a lot of people said to me early on. Ingrid, are you proposing that the environment is racist? How could that be? And of course, as I explained to you today, it's racist because the policies are racist. The policies sometimes exclude individuals purposely or not purposely, intentionally, unintentionally, but they're harmful. So that's the racism. It's the racism in the policies, in the decision-making, and who gets to make policies. So I've wanted to kind of address the issue from multiple angles. I think there's not one way to address environmental racism. There's not one way to address any issue. And addressing the issue from using multiple approaches is not only just fun for me, I find it fun, but it's to me been effective over the past few years in terms of addressing it in different ways. And I think the ways that I've done it, it's all intersecting, right? I mean, if you increase awareness about the issue, which I've done because I'm always doing a talk or planning an event, if you increase awareness about an issue, people empathize with the issue. If they empathize with the issue, then they're more willing to act on the issue. If government empathizes and fully understands the issue, then they're more likely perhaps to pass Bill C-230 that I'm going to talk about later. So I'm always organizing events. This is an event I organized in 2015 at the Central Library. Standing up is Lenore Zan, a politician. You've got Doreen Bernard, who was walking along the Shabaganagadie River. I showed you a photo of her earlier. You've got Mary Desmond in blue in the middle, who is a colleague of James Desmond in Lincolnville. And you've got in the green Lynn Jones, who's a noted activist in Halifax. Her brother was Rocky Jones, who was very involved in the civil rights movement in Nova Scotia and the Black Panther movement in the United States as well. He had connections there. So addressing or raising awareness about environmental racism from multiple angles through panels of speakers who are coming at the issue from different perspectives, the activist perspective, the professor perspective, the politician perspective is really certainly key. It's what we all do. I'm not doing anything that other people aren't doing, but I think what I do, which is different from other people in Nova Scotia, is I bring both the Indigenous and Black communities together. I find Nova Scotia extremely segregated. And when I left Toronto for Nova Scotia, I was going to events, Indigenous events, and looking behind me, and all I saw was either white people or other Indigenous people. And I was like, where are the Black folks? When I go to Black events similarly. So what I do in my events is I bring both communities together always, which I think is really important. Of course, being a professor, I need to write. I'm documenting my findings. So this is a book that I wrote in 2018 to talk about my journey conducting the Enrich project, the challenges I've had, the reason I wrote the book, the arguments I'm trying to address, the things that people told me early on, the people who were doubtful about the existence of environmental racism, but also talking about the grassroots mobilizing of communities. I wanted to pack all of that in this book. I had a student in 2016 create this map. A lot of the people who were kind of doubtful about environmental racism, the reality of it, they were no longer after this map came out. This map was published in Canadian Geographic, on CBC, etc. And it shows the spatial clustering of Indigenous and Black communities across Nova Scotia. There are 2 layers to this map that you will find on the Enrich Project website. One layer for African Nova Scotians, another layer for Indigenous people. And it actually shows you the specific communities, how close incinerators, pulp and paper mills, and landfills are to these communities. So people often look at that and they say, okay, there's something to this. I also founded an NGO called Rural Water Watch in 2017 with a group of geologists and environmental scientists and environmental students. We did this short project in Lincolnville. We decided to test the water in Lincolnville because Lincolnville folks don't want the government to do it, and they can't afford to do it. So we thought, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to test their water, provide the findings, do a profile on the community, share the findings, go back to a workshop. And it worked out really well. So we decided in 2017 that we would use that blueprint to form an NGO, and we did, Rural Water Watch, which got charitable status this year. And we do what the Enrich Project doesn't do. So I keep it separate. Rural Water Watch is simply about testing water. It's not about getting into political issues or legislation or activism. It's simply about testing water in rural communities. Doesn't matter if they're white, blue, pink. It doesn't matter what race. If you live in a rural community, we are interested in testing your water because we know that rural communities tend to be on well water, which is more contaminated. So this has been working out really well. And we started an annual Healthy Wells Day, October 18th of this year. That is both a kind of in-person awareness raising event and an online one. So I posted infographics and different information about the need to keep your well healthy, because if you don't keep your well healthy, it has an impact on your health. But we also went to communities and we collected samples, tested their water, and shared that with them. So much of what we do is also sharing information through workshops as well, going to different communities and answering questions, providing them with information, and of course, testing water. I've also worked with EcoJustice. EcoJustice is a law charity across Canada, and they opened up an office in Halifax in 2018. I went down there to meet with the lawyers, and I discussed the issues of concern here in Nova Scotia, the communities I had been working with, and they started working with those communities to look at legal remedies to address environmental racism in some of these communities, whether it be a class action lawsuit or private prosecution, etc. I'm also working with Let's Sprout. It's an NGO led by two former Dalhousie students in the sustainability department. And we are trying to just get into the education system. For me, the root of the problem is that our leaders don't have a critical understanding of environmental racism, how it manifests, the subtle ways, the systemic ways in which it manifests and impacts communities. I don't blame them. You know, how many of us had the benefits of that type of education? If you think back to the education that you got, you probably learned stereotypical things about Black people and about Indigenous people. You didn't really get a critical understanding of systemic inequalities, how they play out and how they shape communities. So what we're trying to do with this project is to develop creative, innovative online tools that middle school and high school teachers can use in the classroom to teach about environmental racism, to teach about the histories of Black and Indigenous peoples. That's the first stage, because we know that young people like to learn often in creative ways, but we also want to provide these tools to teachers to teach this information in creative ways. That's the first stage. The second stage of this project is certainly more ambitious, and it's going to be extremely challenging, but how do we transform the curricula in Nova Scotia, the high school and middle school curricula, because they're not teaching this stuff? How do we embed issues of environmental racism, systemic inequalities, the histories of Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities into the curricula? That's going to be difficult. But that's our long-term goal, as well as making teachers much more comfortable talking about this. There's no sense doing this project if teachers, most of whom are white, in Nova Scotia are not comfortable talking about race or environmental racism. So part of the work has to be about getting people comfortable talking about difficult subjects. I'm also pairing up with Climate Action Services. These are retired environmental scientists, climate change experts who reached out to me about doing workshops, specifically in the African Nova Scotian community. They have done workshops in the Indigenous community, and they said it worked out really well. And they wanted to do something similar in the African Nova Scotian community. I don't know if I'm going to work with them. We just put a grant in. I feel very positive about it. But if we get funded, we will be doing workshops in 4 African Nova Scotian communities to engage them in the topic of climate change, because I feel that a lot of racialized communities are not engaged in the topic. And I think a lot of it has to do with the messaging, you know, the way in which we communicate about climate change, the doom and gloom of it, and the greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think the messaging is getting to many of us, despite race, or in spite of our race, racial background. But I think for African Nova Scotian communities and Indigenous communities, the messaging isn't reaching them in many ways. So how do we engage the Black community in Nova Scotia to engage with this issue, to see it as something that's important, to see it as something that they have power? You know, they have some kind of power in terms of intervening. So the workshop is going to get a sense of their priorities and concerns about the social, economic, and political impacts of and health impacts of climate change, but also building their capacity to adapt to climate change as an individual, as a member of your family, and as a community member. Because one thing is, you know, African Nova Scotians love their communities. They're very, very proud people. I find them extremely proud people. So if you love your community, don't you want to protect it against climate change? So I think that's the angle. That's the in, you know, it's like we've got to make this work very personal. And I don't think climate scientists are doing doing a very good job, if I'm to be honest, of in terms of developing the messaging that's actually capturing people. I also train students, of course, as any professor does, but what I found fascinating is that environmental racism is so interdisciplinary. Over the past 8 years, I've had students approach me wanting to volunteer or to have me introduce them to affected community members because they want to engage in civil disobedience from so many different departments at Dow: sociology, planning, geography, health, medicine, the law school, environmental science, environmental studies, on and on. I recognized how interdisciplinary this topic of environmental racism is. I didn't recognize that earlier on. Everyone feels like they have a stake in it. Every discipline, many students, faculty members, there's something that they can bring to it, but also can take from it. It's been thrilling for me because I get to learn from people in disciplines that are not my own. Of course, I'm a sociologist by training, but learning from environmental scientists and students in environmental studies, and certainly people in planning, the way they understand this topic has been fascinating for me because I get to learn from faculty members and students. Media is key, continues to be key in my work. This is how I raise awareness. Continue to speak to radio people, podcasts, television interviews, print. I continue to do it. It's very tiring. I think since the movie came out, I've been bombarded, to be honest with you. So I have to say no at times, but I think for those people who say to me, never heard of environmental racism, and some still say that in Nova Scotia, despite all the events that I hold, there's always going to be somebody. I think I need to continue to do this. Once again, this is not just about raising awareness. It's about, can you build a sense of empathy in people? If they understand the issue, they're going to really understand it in their gut, empathize with it, and then say, maybe I want to do something about it. Certainly an aspect of media is the film. With Ellen Page, I don't have time to explain the way it all happened. It was shocking and interesting, but she reached out to me on Twitter in October of 2018, Googled environmental racism, found my name. She said my name kept coming up, reached out to me. She had read my book, reached out to me to tell me how she liked the book. She wanted to leverage her celebrity, her fame, to not just help me and my project and raise awareness about my book, but she wanted to support the women on the front lines. We spoke a few times and we decided a film would be great. In April of 2019, she came up to Halifax. She was born in Nova Scotia. She came up and she filmed over 6 days, myself and the community members, and went to Toronto International Film Festival, September 9th of 2019. There we are on the red carpet, and we spoke to, talk about great knowledge mobilization. We spoke to international media, certainly, Los Angeles Times, Rolling Stone magazine, Time magazine was the first outlet that actually shared our trailer. So this was a whirlwind time in my life, rushing with my high heels on to different media outlets. It was a thrill. It was a thrill. And I think I don't have time to talk about it today, but I think a lot of things that I've seen that have been resolved since the film came out, I really think it has a lot to do with this film. And it has to do with community mobilizing and everything that the communities have done over the decades, certainly, but I think the film has had a lot to do with it. So it started streaming on Netflix March 29th of this year, and of course, more attention, of course. And what I've loved is that I've had people from around the world reach out to me to say how inspiring the women are. I said earlier that Indigenous and Black people do not have economic clout. They do not have much political clout. That's very true. But what the film shows is that women, these women in the film who do not have that type of clout, still have a lot of power, because in very small ways, they have been able to make huge impacts in their community, despite their gender, despite their race and their culture. They've had huge impacts. So yes, that's extremely inspiring to perhaps young Indigenous Black people who are watching the film saying, I don't have much clout. I'm not rich. I'm Black, I'm Indigenous, but there's still some things that I can do that could be pretty powerful. in small ways or big ways. So what has really been thrilling about this for me is hearing from people around the world saying, those women have inspired me. Ingrid, how can I take action? Tell me what I can do. This is exactly what I wanted the film to do. Here's Lenore Zan. I've been trying to get this bill passed since 2015. We collaborated on a environmental racism bill in Nova Scotia, the first environmental racism bill ever in Canada, called Bill 111. It went to second reading, never got passed through to legislation. So she approached me this year before COVID hit in February, and she said, I'm going to turn this bill that we did into a federal bill. What do you think about that? I said, that's fantastic. Having a federal bill would be great. She introduced it on February 26th of this year. It's called a National Strategy to Address Environmental Racism, Bill C-230, and then COVID hit, stopped us in our tracks because her plan was to put it forward to second reading in the spring. So I'm happy to say that she is putting it forward to second reading on December 3rd. I'm currently involved in a campaign that's been extremely exhausting, trying to support this bill by getting some media attention for it, and also sending out emails and Twitters and bothering politicians like Justin Trudeau on my Twitter page. I'm actually terrified. It's not something that I like doing. I'm terrified that Justin Trudeau will come back at me and say, Ingrid Waldron, can you stop? So, but anyway, I'm just going to do it, and then that's that. But I just want people to know about this bill. I would love you to support the bill. You can find out all the information on my website, www.enrichproject.org. I've got a page there that tells you exactly what you need to do. You don't have to think. You can just take the letter I crafted and you can send it out to the politicians. I have their emails there. I don't have every single email, but I have a link to every single MP, and you can find their emails and their phone numbers. But I'm really looking for support across Canada for this bill. I think it's time that this bill becomes legislation. I'm also working on a new national anti-environmental racism coalition with a guy in Toronto by the name of Naulo Charles, who reached out to me. What he wants to do is focus on the need to get Black people specifically into the environmental sector. I mentioned earlier on that environmental racism manifests over time because who do we see in our NGOs, on boards, commissions? White people mostly. So his mission is to kind of get Black people more involved in the environmental sector in terms of profession, in terms of work. My focus will be about expanding what the Enrich Project has been doing in Nova Scotia, expanding it to the Canadian context, doing more of the same, but doing it bigger. So we are connected now with Makeway. Makeway is a charitable organization, which means that the Enrich Project is now a charity. It never has been. It was always just a project that was funded every now and then by a SSHRC grant. But now it is an NGO. So we are working together right now on a campaign to raise funds, but also to strategize on how we can build this thing, or just build it bigger and better, and certainly find ways to engage people across Canada. And finally, I was approached by Peter Wood, who used to work with the David Suzuki Foundation, Blue Dot Foundation. And the David Suzuki Foundation has been interested for some time in securing a legal right to a healthy environment in Canada. We don't have that. Many countries around the world have it. I forgot which ones, but in Canada, we don't have a legal right to a healthy environment. So we put out an op-ed yesterday or today, asking the government to look at Bill C-230, which I'm campaigning around, the environmental racism bill, but also the right to a healthy environment and UNDRIP as well. So we are just kind of strategizing on different actions we can take to get the attention of Justin Trudeau in order for him to, consider securing a legal right to a healthy environment. So those are some of the activities I've been involved in through the Enrich Project over the years, and I'm always open to new opportunities. They always come my way. As soon as I decide that I want to meet with somebody in my office, or I get an invitation to speak with somebody, they take me down another road. So the Enrich Project has been thrilling for me because I'm always going down another road every time I meet somebody new. So I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. That was really, really fascinating. So the question first will come from our two responders. Let me just go back to my notes quickly. So Premièrement, Carlo Charles, qui poursuit. Est-ce que Carlo est là? Oui, toujours là. Donc, Carlo, qui poursuit actuellement un doctorat conjoint en sociologie, en fait, entre l'Université McMaster et en géographie avec l'Université des Antilles en France. Sa thèse examine comment les compréhensions interculturelles de la race, de l'ethnicité et du nationalisme façonnent l'intégration sociopolitique des réfugiés, haïtiens en particulier, au Canada et en France. Et puis récemment, Carlo a fait plusieurs interventions donc, qui se basent sur ses travaux pour contribuer au débat public sur la fermeture des frontières canadiennes en réponse à la COVID-19. Il a également milité pour les droits des étudiants internationaux au sein de nombreuses organisations. Donc, merci Carlo et bienvenue. The second respondent we have is Nadia Joe. She is born and raised in the Yukon. She is Black Pamo on her mother's side, First Nation, as well as Tlingit on her father's side. She has studied chemistry and environmental management and has worked for many years in water management, actually in wastewater treatment. She's been supporting a number of Indigenous communities across Canada to advance their interest in water protection and watershed governance. So who wants to go first? Nadine? And then Carlo. Nadia, sorry, yes.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Dr. Waldron. Wow, what a journey, what a thrilling journey you've been on. Thank you for sharing it with us. So just so you're aware, Dankeka Gala Uye, so that's my name in my father's language. Njau Insquash Lileko, which is in my mother's language, Inklikat Mushin. My name, of course, is Nadia Joe, and it's, as always, a privilege just to share this space with you. I've got two questions, which I'll try to condense, but I first really just need to express my immense gratitude to you, Dr. Waldron, for your work in this area. Effectively to make what's been invisible for so long and make it transparent so that it's there for all of us to see. And many of the examples that you shared in your book paralleled my own experience, my own observations when working with communities across Canada who are battling the effects of the mining industry. And your work really has become my entry point into better understanding that broader context of systemic inequality and how it perpetuates the asymmetries of power and knowledge that occur within our communities. So I just again want to express my thanks to you for activating change within a system that has been so deliberately designed to exclude us and the communities to which we belong. So you had mentioned your work around Bill C-20, and yesterday here in BC, we celebrated our first anniversary of the passing of the Declaration Act, which recognizes human rights, the human rights of Indigenous peoples. And I'm wondering, you know, within the context of Canada, starting to make that some slow progress towards reconciliation, whether or not that creates any new opportunities for this policy, for this piece of legislation, or new policies.
Definitely. I mean, I think we're in our schools, certainly, and in our communities. And in terms of government, there's certainly much more engaged discussion on reconciliation. And the communities that I work with, they're looking at the intersection, certainly, of environmental racism and reconciliation as well. So I think it's a perfect time, because I think we're engaged in these conversations, for people to look at the bill and to start to consider some of the issues as intersecting issues around environmental racism and health inequalities. So the op-ed that we published yesterday or today actually captured many of the issues that Indigenous people and Black people in this country have been dealing with outside of environmental racism, because we were trying to make the connections that these are intersecting issues. And if you're going to address one of these issues, it's important to address all of these issues. So I think certainly this year, as we know, there has there has been more discussion about systemic racism and environmental racism. Certainly the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic has helped with that, but I'm seeing certainly in Nova Scotia and in Canada, just in terms of what I'm seeing on email and on the sites that I visit, that there's more talk about Indigenous issues, reconciliation, reparations for Black individuals. I see some organizations taking action. I see universities taking action on these issues. There are things that I'm seeing right now that I've never seen before in Canada in terms of addressing systemic issues. So I think it's a perfect time for the bill and for all these things that are connecting issues that are collapsing into each other. I think it's a perfect time for this bill to pass, I think. And when I started my campaign 2 days ago, I had MPs reach out to me to let me know that they have reached out to other MPs who are very much interested in seeing this bill passed. They're talking in groups, they're having conversations in groups to find or figure out ways to strategize around this bill. So I'm seeing kind of a groundswell in the way that I've never seen before, and I think it's a really perfect time. I think 2020 has been a horrific year. It will certainly go down in history. It was a horrific year, but it was also a very good year because I think people are open. I think they're open to listening to some of these issues, and perhaps it's not a great thing that they need to see that these things need to be visible, that they need to see George Floyd choked in order to see these things, but that's what it's done. I think this year, and I see in Nova Scotia people are much more open to listening and understanding these issues and wanting to have a critical understanding of these issues, not a surface level understanding that we tend to engage in Canada. Because I think in Canada, we are so focused on direct forms of racism, the kinds of racism that we can see. And I think in Canada, there's an absence of this understanding of systemic inequality and how it weaves itself into our systems and our structures. But I'm seeing people engaging in that more so than ever in this year. So I really think it's a perfect time for all of this. Let's see, like, it's been a long journey with this bill. But I can say I'm hopeful, and I think Lenore Zan also said to me that she's extremely hopeful that this will get to legislation. And I think the other things will follow. You know, I think other bills will follow if there's some milestone that happens this year. I think it facilitates the passing of other bills.
Thank you. It does feel like there's a real confluence of energy all kind of flowing into this direction around, particularly when I think about some of the self-governance functions that a lot of First Nations are beginning to resume in their territories. And many of them are beginning to look at passing their own legislation, which could include the legal rights to not only a healthy environment, but the legal personhood rights of the environment itself. Mm-hmm. I've got one other question, and it's really around, you know, when I read chapter 3, and I was thinking about rethinking waste, and I was thinking about that broader context that you had really opened my mind to, you know, studying, coming from the natural sciences. I'm generally not exposed to this language around resistance. It's not part of my everyday vocabulary. And so you got me thinking about these systems that we operate in, particularly thinking about the systems of capitalism and racism as a pillar of capitalism that upholds that capitalistic structure. And it got me thinking about ecosystem sciences. And, you know, we think about systems actually function perfectly to achieve the result that it's currently achieving. And so when I was thinking about, you know, the rethinking waste, it seems to me we need to rethink a much broader structure. We need to think about consumption, and we need to think about what's driving, what's perpetuating our constant need for accumulating material goods and services, particularly when it doesn't really serve any of us in the long term. So I'm wondering if you could just offer some thoughts or some comments on that.
I think that's going to be the most challenging thing. I remember when I was writing the book and the publisher at Fernwood said, we need a whole change up in our system. And at the root of it is the way in which we consume, right? And Louise DeLille in the film actually mentioned that. What if we could kind of be able to reuse our waste? So I find that to be, because the challenge of addressing environmental racism is capitalism. And doing away with capitalism and profit is certainly what we're hoping to achieve, and the way in which we consume. But I think that requires a dismantling of our systems, but a change in the way that people think. And it's part of the solution, but I don't have the solution. I don't have ideas about how that can be done. And that's why I think this is an extremely difficult issue to address. So I try to address it by piecemeal, but certainly it's the way we consume. I mean, when we think of this year and the pandemic, when we were being asked to, you know, many of the grocery stores started asking us to use reusable bags, and that seemed to cause friction from a lot of people. They were asking us to do things very differently, right? So the grocery store across the street from me, they no longer use plastic bags. And I remember when that started happening, I was a bit uncomfortable. Like, what am I going to do? And they were giving us the choice of using reusable bags, and now it's natural for me. So I think the pandemic in many ways showed us that we are able to do this. It's slow going, but it's possible, because my mindset completely changed from where I thought this is impossible, no plastic bags, it's going to be very difficult, to where now that is exactly what I'm doing every day. I remember to take my reusable bag and go to the grocery store. So that's part of it, but I think it requires a complete shift in how we see our world and what we're willing to give up and willing to do. And I'm not sure what is the solution to that, but just through the pandemic this year, I saw that that is actually possible. And in terms of how it's changed our lifestyle, I mean, there are a lot of articles about that as well. Even the fact that we are doing everything on Zoom, that, you know, when we were asked to stop traveling in particular areas, that was uncomfortable in the beginning, but we got used to that. There are a lot of things that I and other people got used to not having and not doing that actually were beneficial in terms of our consumption. And at a certain point, we got very comfortable with it, and it became the norm. It became part of our lives. It became easy, where at some point it seemed like it was going to be extremely difficult. I remember reading an article this year about that, all the things that we were asked to do this year because of the pandemic that we are doing, and we are kind of doing with ease, that we thought was going to be very complex and extremely difficult and challenging, that would upset our lives, that has not. So, you know, I don't know, you know, I don't like to necessarily say that the pandemic was something spiritual, but I think for me, I think there's something underlying around the pandemic, that it happened for a reason. And it showed us in many ways a new way of doing things. It was horrific, but there are a lot of great things that to me came out of this year. Allowed us to see that we were strong, that we're resourceful, that we can do things that we never thought that we could do. So there's something underlying this pandemic that I see as spiritual, that was and many people have talked about this, teaching us a lesson. And I've seen it in my life in terms of what I thought I couldn't tolerate and what I realized I can tolerate. So yeah, unfortunate that it took something like this, but I think there was a lesson somewhere in this. And in terms of consumption and the environment, I've seen it in my own life, in terms of how there are things that I no longer need, that I thought I needed to have. So that's the start for me. It's just a huge shift, and maybe it's through the education system, it's through messaging, it's through industry, it's through the private sector. There's a responsibility in those spaces in order to support a different way of thinking about how we consume. But all these things have to work together. The messaging has to be coherent, but the messaging also has to be specific to specific communities, because different communities experience the world, their lives, the environment in very specific ways, right? Indigenous communities and Black communities experience environmental issues in very unique and specific ways, and the messaging and how we engage communities in a different way of thinking has to be very targeted. But I think we need all of these different systems to be able to do that. Certainly systems that don't feel that they're going to lose out by changing the way in which we think. But it's private industry, it's labor unions, it's the educational system, it's media. There has to be a kind of coherent messaging. And if there isn't, then that makes it really challenging for us to think a different way in terms of how we consume. It's a great question. It's a very complex question, but yeah. I hope that answered your question a bit.
I struggle with it too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Waldron.
Yeah, we're not going to find that's the $1,000 question, right? But was a really interesting exchange. Carlo, est-ce que tu veux take the floor? Juste une petite minute. Attends, ah oui, là c'est mieux. Là c'est mieux.
Est très mauvaise. Je suis désolé.
Là c'est beaucoup mieux. On t'écoute.
Oui, alors l'importance du travail de la professeure Waldron, c'est surtout en lien avec le fait que la professeure Waldron a pu centrer son analyse sur une compréhension assez large de la question de la race, mais aussi sur les différentes autres problématiques qui ont lien avec la question de la race. Voilà. Et donc, du coup, le travail de Madame Waldron, de point de vue, je vais prendre plutôt le point de vue académique en ce sens pendant 1 minute, et puis après, je vais poser quelques questions. Alors, son travail dans le livre, et puis aussi dans le documentaire, ça nous rappelle que le concept de race et aussi le concept de racisme, c'est un concept qui, justement, produit qui produit des perceptions du monde, qui favorise certains groupes et aussi qui défavorise d'autres groupes. Voilà, donc je pense que c'est ça le côté le plus important de ce que j'ai pu lire de son travail. Alors, à travers son travail, elle nous a aussi rappelé comment le concept de racisme en tant que tel imprègne la manière dont les politiciens, les décideurs publics, les institutions voient et perçoivent les différents groupes avec lesquels ils interagissent, mais aussi comment ils décident des politiques publiques qu'ils vont prendre, qui vont, par exemple, voter, pour lesquelles ils vont voter, et qui vont affecter certaines communautés. Alors, cette particulière concentration ou ce focus sur le concept de race est hyper important, particulièrement parce que jusqu'à présent, en 2022, même s'il y a beaucoup d'avancées, on va dire, ou une petite évolution de la mentalité des gens par rapport aux questions de race, aujourd'hui, en 2020, il y a encore beaucoup de personnes qui peinent à avoir des conversations assez profondes, assez sérieuses et assez rigoureuses sur le concept, par exemple, de racisme systémique, sur une compréhension un peu plus globale de la façon dont le racisme systémique affecte les différents aspects de la vie des personnes. Et donc, du coup, évidemment, le contexte de la pandémie du Covid-19 et aussi tout le mouvement Black Lives Matter, tout ça a contribué énormément à justement changer un peu la mentalité, à rendre plus visibles ces problèmes de racisme systémique que les communautés, on connaît très bien, que ce soit des communautés noires ou des communautés indigènes, ce qui est justement assez intéressant. Voilà. Alors, les questions que j'ai à poser, justement, ça va être 2 petites questions. La première question, c'est le rôle, c'est un rapport avec le rôle du chercheur ou de la chercheuse dans la recherche collaborative avec les communautés. Alors, ce qu'on a pu voir, c'est qu'à partir du moment où la professeure Waldron a décidé de travailler avec les communautés, il y a eu une forme il y a une nouvelle énergie, justement, qui est apparue au sein de ces différentes communautés en donnant une visibilité institutionnelle à ce genre de problème, ce qui a aussi permis à ce qu'il y ait énormément de collaboration avec, bien sûr, d'autres personnes telles que Ellen Page, etc. Donc, de votre point de vue, Madame Waldron, quel est le rôle du chercheur ou de la chercheuse dans l'élaboration d'une recherche collaborative avec des communautés et comment justement l'institution universitaire peut contribuer à décloisonner le savoir universitaire qui reste souvent entre les quatre murs de l'université pour que ça soit utile aux communautés, pour que ça justement puisse contribuer à ce qu'on appelle en anglais the empowerment des différentes communautés. Donc ça, c'est la première question et je pose l'autre question rapidement. L'autre question a rapport avec justement le rôle des alliés blancs. À la fin du livre, vous avez rappelé l'importance d'avoir des alliés qui ne soient pas forcément noirs ou indigènes ou autochtones, pardon, mais des alliés blancs et des alliés blanches dans la lutte contre le racisme environnemental. Alors la question que je pose par rapport à ça, quel doit être le rôle de ces alliés, d'une part, et d'autre part, quel est l'équilibre que l'on doit avoir entre le rôle de ces alliés et aussi la visibilisation des membres des communautés qui, depuis des décennies, travaillent justement pour améliorer ce genre de problème. Voilà.
Wow.
Yeah. Did you get all that?
No, you'd have to translate, but it's
okay.
Very involved.
Yeah, so I guess the one question, well, the last question about allies and the role of allies and the role, what's basically the equilibrium between the place that they take, which can be really helpful to the cause, but also giving credit and visibility to people who've been doing this work in the trenches for decades, right? And that their work can be taken over by those allies. So what's the way to find a balance there? And the first question was about your role as a researcher and doing work with communities, basically, and the ethics around that, right? How do you conduct research with communities, and how do you basically get out of the ivory tower and it's basically trying to get some of your thoughts on the responsibility of the university in terms of ethics protocol with researchers working with communities, especially communities that have been incredibly marginalized and sometimes negatively impacted by research historically as well.
So I'll address the first, you said it was his second question, but the first question about allies, but I can also talk about it in terms of myself. People could see me as somebody who's overtaking the research as well, because I have obviously power as a professor. So in terms of allies, and I'm assuming he's talking about white allies, and I have to say that in Nova Scotia, in many ways, it's been great. You know, the white, I'm perhaps in a bubble, so, but, there are strong environmental activists who are white in Nova Scotia who are always up at the Treaty Truck House offering help, funding, setting up GoFundMe pages, and really supportive of the communities that I mentioned, specifically the community that's dealing with the Alton Gas Project because of how they've been able to engage allies. When white students stand up, let's say when I'm doing a presentation, and they often ask this question, which is, Professor Waldron, can you tell me how I can be an ally? I'm a white guy, I've got privilege, can you tell me how I can do it? And I always say that allyship is like a dance. You should know when to come in, and you should know where to kind of pull out, You always have to make sure that the communities are driving the work, that they're leading the work. And when and if you come in, you will know because they will let you know. Community members are experts in their own lives. And sometimes for people perhaps in my position and other professions, we feel we're coming in with the expertise. I'm a professor, I'm an engineer, I'm a geologist, I have the expertise to give you. And yes, that's very important, but we also have to remember that these are communities with expertise in their own lives. They know exactly what they need. What they often don't have are resources or networks. So that brings me to myself in terms of, maybe I'm not considered to be an ally, I am in a way, but I'm a professor who's doing work with communities who could, yes, certainly get the attention from media because they have a focal point in me, Ingrid Waldron, who wrote the book, and there could certainly be attention given to me. But what I have tried to do is position community members, and I don't need to position them, they are, but some people might forget that, as experts in their own lives. So as a community-based researcher, I want the media to speak to them. Media will come to me and say, can you talk to me about the fisheries issue, which was a hot issue a few months ago, still is, in the Indigenous community. And I said, I would really prefer you to speak to somebody from the Mi'kmaq community. I don't want to speak about this issue, but I'm a focal point because they find me on a Conversation, that website called Conversation, that website that collects a list of academics. So they're coming to me. So I think in terms of allyship, for me, it's what are the ways that I can think of that I can highlight the work of community members and position them in places of power in terms of visibility. Another way that I do that is through my presentations. It's extremely rare that I am organizing events or doing talks online like this with academics. I can't think of really the last time I did a talk with another Dalhousie professor. All the talks that I give are with the community members I showed you earlier. They're with me to give their perspective. I did a David Suzuki Foundation talk with a screening of my film. They're there. I'm always inviting them. I'm always worried about exhausting them because I call on them so often, but everything I do, I'm bringing both communities together. They're part of the work. They're part of the presentations. I never forget them. It's rare that I'm doing a presentation with another professor, very rare. In terms of authorship, I held a symposium in 2017, and the American professor really enjoyed it, and he said, I would really like to feature the papers from this symposium in my journal. The journal is called CalFu. It's put out by Temple University, and I co-authored, the articles with the community members who presented at my conference. So they're part of that knowledge construction and knowledge dissemination. So the whole purpose of it was to bring the academic together with the community member to write an article for that journal. So now the community members have published work, right? So for me, it's always about how can I support and highlight the work that they're doing? How are they part of the plan? How do I highlight the expertise that they have? Because ultimately they're the ones with the expertise. I'm coming in as an ally or a researcher to provide the networks, perhaps, the geologist who can do the water testing project that Louise DeLille would not have known, right? She wouldn't have known him, perhaps. I have, as an academic, a list of networks of geologists and professionals and environmental scientists that some communities don't have access to. So for me, that's where I come in. How can I support you in leading the work that you're doing? Because you're the leader, but can I help you with some funding? Can I help you by sharing your GoFundMe page? Can I help people sign the petition that you sent out? Is there a geologist that I can call on that you perhaps need to do the work that you need to do? So, and it's not a perfect situation because I'm not going to pretend that I don't have power. And another professor pointed that out to me when I did a talk at LACAD last year. He said, we can pretend as professors that we're going to reduce the amount of power we have when we do this community-based research, but the reality is we still have it. So that is the reality. I do have it. And how do I try to reduce it? How do I try to get a balance? And for me, it's doing the things that I just discussed in order to highlight the work of community members. Let them share their own experiences in their own way without me getting in the way. So that's the way I do it. In terms of community-based research, I have to say that it was a struggle in the beginning at Dalhousie, but we have this new thing called the Boyers model. And the Boyers model at Dalhousie recognizes the work that I do. It recognizes professors who might want to do knowledge dissemination in a different way. It doesn't mean that you don't publish. Of course, I publish, right? But it means that if this professor wants to do a film, or they want to do a community sharing event, or whatever makes sense for the community, the Indigenous community and Black community, we're going to give that professor credit for that. It doesn't have to be a publication in an academic journal. We want to open up our view about what's credible in terms of academia. So we have that now in our collective agreement as professors, particularly in the Faculty of Health where I am, where they are recognizing the work of professors like me who may want to publish a book, yes, but I also want to produce a film. And I also want to get credit for doing a community meeting. So for me, that's the way to go for universities. In terms of ethics, I struggled with that in the beginning because I said to ethics, one of the Indigenous leaders said to me, I want cash. Like, I don't want you to send me a check from Dalhousie. And I said, I really can't do it any other way. It has to be a check. That's just the way Dalhousie does it. He says, no, but this is going to mess up, I think, his pension, or I forgot exactly. It was about 7 years ago. And I felt really badly because he was angry. He said, we get cash. I want cash. I don't want a check. And ethics and financial services, that doesn't fly, right? So it's not set up in a way that perhaps in that time appreciated community-based research. But since then, things have changed, right? I can get petty cash now. I can put it in my own bank account, and I can now provide community members with cash. So for me, it's been about going to ethics, going to the director of ethics in the past, and actually not arguing with her, but we've had debates about what needs to be done better because I'm doing this type of work. I'm doing community-based research, and these are the things that needs to be changed at ethics in order to understand that there's a particular way in which I need to do things in a way that respects community members. So it has been an effort that I've made, but I think with the Boyers model, it's changed a lot. I don't think every university has that, but this recognition of it's not just about a publication and your H index. It's more than that. And for the communities that we work with, the sharing of knowledge, the fact that Indigenous people own knowledge, right? As professors, typically we think that's ours, that's mine, that's my publication, it's my knowledge. But with Indigenous communities, it's their knowledge, they have ownership over it. So that's a kind of, it's switching up things for the university because traditionally that's not how the university understands things, how a professor understands things. But I know doing this work that doesn't really belong to me. I was involved in the co-creation of it, but it belongs to the Indigenous community.
Thank you for that. Before wrapping up quickly, I just want to take one question from somebody who asked, just you can give a quick answer to. Alexandra Pierre asking, why are you seeing more women, or are you actually seeing more women doing work around environmental racism, environmental justice? Most of the activists that you've mentioned show pictures of in your PowerPoint for women. Is there a reason why that is the case? Is one of the questions that she's asked. If you want to take that quickly before we wrap up.
Question, because it's a question I asked the women that I work with, particularly the Indigenous women, the Mi'kmaq women. I asked Doreen, I said, why is it seems to me that it's always women, and aren't you tired? It's exhausting. And where are the men? And she really educated me. She said, actually, Ingrid, as water protectors and land defenders, this is the role of Indigenous women. We don't feel burdened by this. It's not that the men aren't helping us. Of course they are. They help us in different ways. But we are the life givers. We are responsible for giving life, for birth. Consequently, the role of Indigenous women is to take care of the land and the water. So she said it very matter-of-factly, because I thought she was going to say to me, yeah, you're right, Ingrid. Like, we're tired. Where are the men? And she was almost maybe insulted by me because she was basically saying to me, this is our culture. And I didn't know that, right? So it is part of Indigenous culture to take care of the land and the water. In terms of Black women, I can't really speak to that. I do know that, in Black communities, it's matriarchal, and forever Black women, whether it be the civil rights movement in the 1960s and all the different movements that have happened since then or before then, Black women have been at the forefront. They've been silenced in many ways because of gender, and the people who got attention were Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael, and that's about gender discrimination. But Black women, and of course we know Angela Davis, of course, and others, but Black women have always been, in many ways, leaders in their families, and that has a lot to do with the economic exclusion of Black men, right? Black men are often excluded in many ways from our social structures, our economic systems. So Black women have had to come to the fore and have had to be leaders in many ways. So Black women are leaders in community organizations, particularly in Nova Scotia. When I think about the Black community-based organizations, most of them, I would say, are headed up by women. So that's just a tradition of Black women and Indigenous women. It's part of their being to lead. And that's certainly what I've seen over time as I've continued to do this project, is women leading. And it's been actually thrilling, because I think it's for me it's extremely inspiring.
Well, this talk has been incredibly inspiring. No, thank you from the bottom of my heart for this. And I think there's a lot of participants as well who will also feel lucky to have been here. Merci aussi à Carlo. Thank you, Nadia, for your insightful questions and commentary. We're 7 minutes past our deadline, so I hope you indulge ourselves and indulge us for that and are not too mad for this. Enjoy your Friday night. Yes, thank you. I would say many more things, but we want to respect time. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you everyone for coming. And I hope you will take this topic with you and continue to read and research and learn and act, actually, because yeah, this conversation cannot end with the Zoom. It cannot.
Yes.
Merci.
Thank you, Christiane, Nadia, Carlo, Emile, everybody else. Merci.